Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to Early Church History.
That's right.
And welcome, Father.
Thank you.
It is so good to be back in the studio and recording again. We've had two shows really dealing with the destruction of Jerusalem.
Right.
And what about today?
Today we're going to go back in time. We've found Jerusalem destroyed. Mm-hmm. Now what I want to do is I want to go back into the period about a generation, 2-3 generations before Christ.
Okay.
To see the development that takes place in Palestine and who these characters are. We hear about the Herodians. Yeah. Who's Herod? We hear about the Pharisees. Where did they come from? The Sadducees. Where did they come from? What are these zealots doing around that caused such a problem for the Romans to begin with? What are the Romans doing over there? So today, in this program, and then next week's program, we'll be looking at the remote history, setting the groundwork for explaining what happened in those first two programs that we had.
That sounds wonderful. Sounds like information we all need, especially if we're talking about the Pharisees and the Zealots. Yeah. and where all they come from. We need to know this history.
Yeah, and it's I'm going to talk about a couple good sources that we have that
Great.
We can turn to. I always like to bring in books so
yes.
that people can read more beyond what we're doing here. But even before that, I just want to point out, and I'm not the first one to discover this by any means. There are a lot of other people that have noticed this, that the fact that Jesus came when he came and where he came was itself absolutely providential. So the setup that we're going to be looking at this program and program number 4 is going to show us how all of these things are coming together, setting everything up perfectly for the incarnation. You've got Pax Romana. You've got the Roman Empire, in which there is relative peace and stability so people can move around. There's a lingua franca that is in the Roman Empire at this time. It's Greek. It's common Koine Greek. Everybody, even in Spain, if you wanted to communicate with everybody else, you knew common Greek. And Greek was spoken in Rome, as well as Latin, and it was spoken in the Holy Land. And so when those letters are written by the apostles, when the Gospels are written, they're written in that Greek, and everybody can read them. They're very easily circulated. So you've got that. You've got great transportation in the Mediterranean, in the Aegean Sea, large urban populations, caravan routes that are going to carry people and ideas to the south and to the east. And then on top of all of this, you have an absolute bankruptcy of spirituality. This is a moment in time, particularly among the Romans, the Greeks, the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, when the old gods just don't answer the questions anymore, and there's a searching for truth, and truth comes. Mm-hmm. It's you can't beat this. This is great, So, but then, so the time is perfect, but then you have to turn around and question God as to the location. Why Judaic Palestine? It's a mess.
Okay.
It's always a mess, but it's a pot that's about to boil over. We're going to look at some of these factors and factions and forces that are all involved in this, and the church is founded right in the middle of all of that. So for background reading, I would definitely recommend Warren Carroll's first volume of his History of Christendom. Now, he goes into a long detail, a couple hundred pages of Israelite history, way before Christ. And it gives a real good background. If you don't have a good background in the history of the Jews before Christ, this is a really good source for that. And then, of course, when he takes up with the Christian era, he does his typically wonderful job. And not only is it readable, but it's also got great footnotes to it, and it's a real treasure. And of course, I think he's on volume 6 or 7 now,
right,
all the way up until beyond the French Revolution. I just recently got his latest book. So Warren Carroll, The History of Christendom. Second, another old, I'm sure it's out of print, but it's always around. You can find it in old bookstores and book fairs and stuff. And this is called The Daily Life in the Time of Jesus. And it's by a Frenchman, Henri Daniel-Rope, and it's a real standard book also, and it's very readable, gives a lot of very interesting insights. This is a book that I really recommend someone to read along with reading the New Testament, because it fleshes it out. It goes into great detail about who the Pharisees were and what they believed, and the Sadducees and all of that. So that's very helpful. Another fellow that we mentioned last time around, F.F. Bruce, his book called The New Testament History. It's in paperback, and it's very readable, and it also it's a really good source. And then two other names I'd like to throw in. Henry Chadwick has a book out in the Penguin series. It's called Early Church History. It's a pretty good one. It's good. And then also another name that people are not that familiar with, and that's Hans Lietzmann. It's Lietzmann. He was a German historian, wrote a 4-volume history of the early church up until about the time of Constantine Theodosius, and that's a real good source also. And then another one that you don't hear much about, but I found to be absolutely fascinating, and it's a book by two individuals. One of them is Richard Horsley, and the other is John Hanson, and it's entitled Bandits, Prophets, and Messiahs, Popular Movements at the Time of Jesus, and offers some really interesting stuff, too.
It sounds like a good title.
Yeah, really. So in order to understand, I mean, it's like, you can't start talking about the American Revolution in 1776. You got to go to the background stuff. And so we're going to do the same thing then today and in our next series and take a look at this. And to do this, two of the great books of history, biblical books of history, will help us a lot, and that's the books of Maccabees, 1st and 2nd Maccabees. And I'd like to cite 1st Maccabees. I won't quote from it, but 1st Maccabees, the first chapter, verses 1 through 10, they begin talking about an individual, one individual in particular, and it says the book says that brings about causing much distress on the earth. And this man, his name is Antiochus Epiphanes, and he is an evil offshoot. He comes to power in 175 BC. So we're almost 2 centuries before Christ. And one of the reasons why he is this sinful offshoot and is vilified in the book of Maccabees, both of the books, so much, is because he is an unabashed Hellenizer. Remember that Alexander the Great had conquered much of the known world and had all throughout his empire, which was very short-lived, he died a young man, he tried to introduce the Greek ideals in each of these, and the Greeks had a lot to offer, but the other side of this was that they were also heavy-handed, and in the case of Antiochus Epiphanes, were forcing their culture on another culture. It would be what you would call cultural imperialism. And we find that today, there is a certain contempt in the world today for the United States, and it's not because of the people. And everywhere you go, people like Americans as individuals, and it's not necessarily the government. This government has done more to free human beings than anybody. I mean, you just look at the end of the Cold War, and just go on and on. But I think the one thing that people just have a real hard time with, and I do too, is American cultural imperialism. And I'm talking about here is pornography. It's terrible. Our movies, are horrible.
Yes.
Some of our clothing companies and their ads, are just embarrassing. There's a breakdown of the family, of morals. There is an exaltation of homosexuality, of substance abuse, an exaltation of these things. And even in the United States, there are many, many people who are disgusted with this, and everybody talks about doing something about it. Nobody's doing anything about it. But that's the kind of thing that the Jews found to be so distasteful about the Hellenizers, because they were coming in and introducing much of the same sort of thing, and so there is this tension. Now, it's not always like that. When Palestine had been under the control of a different group of Greeks, these are the Ptolemies. I remember that the empire was divided up into 3 or 4 different sections. His generals took over, and Ptolemy took over Egypt, and it also included much of Palestine. By doing that, what they did there was they introduced Hellenism, but it was like an option. It's here if you want it. But it wasn't forced on anybody. However, what happens is there's a shift in these kingdoms, and eventually you had the Syrian group of the Seleucid dynasty take over Syria, Mesopotamia, Persia, and Palestine, and these are much more heavy-handed, and they tend much more toward forcing Hellenism on people. One of the things they do is they actually do this by moving people in. They literally pull in Greeks to live in the midst of these Hebrews, and they establish cities. We know a number of these cities. Ptolemais is a port city. It becomes the port city of Acre. Others we're somewhat familiar with, even from the scriptures. Archelaus. In the Transjordan, you've got the fortress city of Macreus. That's the fortress where John the Baptist was held and was beheaded. Geraza, Pella, which we talked about last week, Gadara, Dera, and Decapolis. These are all Greek-oriented cities. Jerusalem, however, becomes the real contentious issue, because the Seleucid dynasty, this is that Greek dynasty out of Syria, is looking at Jerusalem, and they're seeing it as a very important city. It's set up on top of the hills, right? And it is a contact point between the interior and the coast, so that there's an east-west axis there, and also there's a north-south axis, and so Jerusalem is just strategically a very important place to be, besides being a very important city. And so they begin looking, they set their sights on Jerusalem. Wow, that's a holy city.
The center of that cross of northwest, east, north, south, east, and west, huh?
Yeah. Now, the thing is that they have to find collaborators, because they just can't move into Jerusalem. So they have to find Hellenizers within the group themselves. And surprisingly and shockingly, they find it where? Among the nobles, the Jewish nobles, and Jewish priests. Now, they have one problem they have to deal with, and that is the high priest. His name is Onias III. And he lives from 196 to 175. He's the high priest during that period of time. He is a holy man, and he is the son of a holy man, Simon, the son of Johanna, who is mentioned 3 times in the book of Sirach. And so he's going to be someone to worry about. And so the book of Maccabees itself describes the situation. Just a little of the first 3 verses in the 3rd chapter of the second book it says the following: while the holy city lived in perfect peace, and the laws were strictly observed because of the piety of the high priest Onias and his hatred of evil, the kings themselves honored the place and glorified the temple with the most magnificent gifts. Thus, Seleucus, the king of Asia, that is to say, he's the Greek king living in Antioch of Syria. Okay, Seleucus defrayed from his own revenues all the expenses necessary for the sacrificial services. Those three verses tell us of a wonderful holy Jerusalem. Things are great. Everyone's following the law. They've got a very holy high priest. Even the king, the Greek king in Syria, is deferring revenues so that the monies can be used for the sacrifices. You can't ask for anything better.
That sounds good.
It's not going to last long. What happens is that Seleucus himself is murdered, and as a result, it's his brother Antiochus Epiphanes who now becomes the king in Syria. His very name speaks of an arrogance. Epiphanes, the God manifest. You know, you want to see God? Look at me. You know, we're going to have some problems with this guy. He's looking around for a collaborator, and he finds him in the superintendent of the temple. This is the overseer of the temple itself, and his name is Simon. He's of the priestly order of Bilgah, and he has a quarrel with the high priest Onias. And as they're quarreling, he sides with the Greeks, the Hellenizers, and he sends a report to Antiochus Epiphanes it's an audit of what's in the temple. And so he reports that there are 400 talents of silver and 200 talents of gold in the temple. Now I didn't sit down to figure out how much that was, but remember when we talked earlier about how much a talent is, and a talent is about 85 pounds of stuff, and so you can imagine what a pound, 1 pound of silver would be worth, considering how much it is an ounce, or gold. My goodness, there's a lot of money sitting there, and that money was specifically set there for widows and for orphans. Also, the patrimony of Hyrcanus, extremely wealthy, and the money was set there, and the word comes out then that Antiochus Epiphanes was going to send his own audit team down to look into the temple. Well, when the chief auditor got down to Jerusalem, all the priests and all the people of Jerusalem prayed that this would not turn out bad. And what happened was that the auditor ended up becoming deathly ill. And so Onias III went before the people and offered a special prayer for the recovery of the auditor, who then recovered and then did his audit, and it turned out that everything was exactly as it was supposed to be. And everyone's happy except for Simon, because he had set the thing up to begin with. And so he claimed that the reason why the auditor got sick to begin with was because of Onias's prayers. And that that it brought on the illness. He found a friend in the family, and this was the brother of Onias. His name is Jason.
Okay.
And he bribed his own way into becoming the next high priest, replacing Onias III. So now here's another thing I think it's important for us to keep in mind. You know that word Jason, that's not a Jewish name.
I didn't think so.
No, it's Greek. And so here is a Jew who is adopted, or has a Greek name, and now he himself becomes the high priest. The description now of what happens to the city of Jerusalem is in stark contrast in the 3rd chapter to the 4th chapter. So here's what the 4th chapter of the 2nd book of Maccabees says, starting with the 10th verse and following. When Jason received the king's approval and came into office, he immediately initiated his countrymen into the Greek way of life. He set aside the royal concessions granted to the Jews through the mediation of John, the father of Epilemos. I'll just skip that there. He abrogated the lawful institutions and introduced customs contrary to the law. And here's some of the things he did. He quickly established a gymnasium at the very foot of the Acropolis. Now, that's an interesting thing. The Acropolis is the high point of the city. He's talking about the Temple Mount. And so even in Scriptures itself here, the Temple Mount is referred to as a Greek name. I think he's pulling our leg here, the author of Second Maccabees. He's showing how far things have fallen in just a few years. Okay, so he sets up this gymnasium at the foot of the Acropolis itself, or at the foot of the Temple Mount, where he induced the noble young men to wear the Greek hat. Now, what that means is it's a broad-rimmed hat. It's called the hat of Hermes, and it was a symbol of athletes back in those days. It's sort of like, I don't know, when I was in high school, they wore leather jackets.
Right.
You knew who an athlete was. So anyway, that was a symbol that they were, and these were the noble Jewish young men wearing the hat, which would also mean that they would be participating in the sports. Now, it's not that the Jews are against sports, but listen to a little bit further. The craze for Hellenism and foreign customs reached such a pitch throughout the outraged wickedness of the ungodly pseudo-high priest Jason, that the priests no longer cared about the service of the altar. So instead of spending their time at the altar, they're going to be down in that gymnasium. You know? And don't think about these priests as being a bunch of old fogies either. You know, these are young men in their 20s. Okay, and so they would be geared to sports.
Sure.
You know. Disdaining the temple and neglecting the services, they hastened at the signal of the discus throwing to take part in the unlawful exercises on the athletic field. They despised what their ancestors had regarded as honors, while they highly prized what the Greeks esteemed as glory. Precisely because of this, they found themselves in serious trouble. The very people whose manner of life they emulated and whom they desired to imitate in everything became their enemies and oppressors. It was no light matter to flout the laws of God, as the following period will show. The hint in this also is that going and doing these, what do we mean by unlawful exercises on the athletic fields? He's specifically talking about wrestling. It is the key sport of the Greeks. And why wrestling? Do Jews have something against wrestling? No, they don't. They have something against the way the Greeks wrestled in the nude.
Oh, okay.
And of course, what would that mean? It would be showing the circumcision, and so they would be attempting to cover up the sign of their covenant. You know, not only that, but the highest form of wrestling is a sport called pankration, which is like what we have nowadays is ultimate fighting.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, you know, people get pretty beaten up on that.
Really injured.
Yeah, and could you imagine a bunch of Jewish priests doing this?
No.
No.
Really,
no,
I can't.
No. And so ultimately Jason is introducing all of this, but it even gets worse because after he's in for a while, he's now replaced by yet another high priest who's even a worse Hellenizer. His name is Menelaus. He's in for 10 years, from 172 to 162 BC. And it's nothing short of a hostile takeover, because what he did was, when he was elected because of bribes. And so he got in, as he's the high priest, he now has access to the treasury, and he raids the treasury in order to pay for the bribes. Then he turns around and raises the taxes on the people. A 200% increase in taxes? You know, that's worse than St. Louis County A property tax.
Property tax.
You know? Yeah. He also had a brother by the name of Lysimachus, and he was even a greater embezzler. He gathered together some 3,000 thugs and used them as sort of a mafia to go around extorting money out of people. So this is just really, and the people in the second book of Maccabees points out that the people are defenseless against these guys. They have stones, they have blocks of wood. They even the only thing they have is like they'll pick up a handful of ash as these thugs are beating them up, and they throw it into their eyes to try to get away. They're just defenseless. Well, now. As this mob, the mafia, this mafia is like taking over Jerusalem. Finally, Antiochus Epiphanes decides he's going to move in. He's going to restore order, which he does. He attacks Jerusalem with an army, takes over. He plunders the temple. He plants Syrian troops right on the Temple Mount itself. There's an abomination. The Holy of Holies is desecrated. The Torah is publicly burned. Many people flee Jerusalem, and now the oppression is about to really get underway. In some ways, this was worse than the Babylonian captivity, and it's a real challenge for Jews to try to understand what's going on. If you look at the prophets in the Old Testament, every time something terrible has happened to the Jews, and every time the prophets have spoken out about this, prophesied, they've always said it's because the people have disobeyed the covenant, and therefore they are being punished. But you notice there's different this time around. Here, they're being punished because they follow the covenant. And this causes a huge problem with them, and also because who are the people who are disobeying the covenant most? The priests.
Right.
You know, and so the people themselves are trying to figure out where's God's will in this. How is this happening? And as a result, you have a turning to sacred books that are not part of the canon of the Old Testament, of the Pentateuch. So they're looking for other books that are even today considered apocryphal books. Things like the Assumption of Moses are written and very much read and meditated on. What's called the Animal Apocalypse, which is First Enoch. Now, Enoch is not in any of our scriptures. Protestants or Catholic or Jews take that, but we know it, and you know it's available. The Epistle of Enoch, another part of the Book of Enoch, parts of the Book of Daniel, Bel and the Dragon, some of the others are introduced around this time too. And what they all have in common is they are all looking at and describing the final days. That is to say, the eschaton, the last days, and they're looking for consolation in the last days. There's a higher theology, I guess, in a sense, coming about, in which they realize that there isn't necessarily going to be a cause and effect. If you do good, God gives you lots of riches. If you do evil, God punishes you. There's something beyond that. Mm-hmm. And maybe now they're beginning to understand a little bit more of what Isaiah had been explaining to them about the suffering servant, that even by doing good, you might be suffering, but by suffering, you're bringing about God's will. An example of this that they have in their own mind is that auditor, Heliodorus, where praying for your enemy can bring about good. And so there's a realization that their hard times are not divine punishment. It's not. That's not what's happening here. But instead, they're being persecuted because they're faithful. And so, therefore, those who consider these things, these are not going to be temple priests who are going to be writing these books or reading these books, but rather they're going to be a literate, learned group of Jews, teachers, rabbis, sages, and scribes, the wise men. There's a Hebrew term for them, the maskalim. And they're going to begin to realize that there is a mysterious plan for God that is revealed in history and in actual, real historical events. God uses righteous suffering to bring about his kingdom. And I think it's important to say this. God uses righteous suffering to bring about his kingdom on earth, but it's not an earthly kingdom. Mm-hmm. And that's part of the problem that there's some people who didn't catch that later on, and so they misunderstood Christ. In the book of Daniel, you've got an example or description of this also in the 12th chapter. And I'm just going to read you the first 4 verses of that. And this is, as I say, the book of Daniel, and it says the following. It says, "At that time there shall arise Michael, the great prince, guardian of your people. It shall be a time unsurpassed in distress, since nations began until that time. And at that time your people shall escape, everyone who is found written in the book. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake." Here, again, now, a real, very overt belief in life after death. And here in resurrection, bodily resurrection, right there in the book of Daniel, 12th chapter. "Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. Some shall live forever. Others shall be an everlasting horror or disgrace." Heaven and hell. It's right there. 12th chapter of Daniel. "But the wise shall shine brightly, like the splendor of the firmament, and those who lead the many to justice shall be like the stars forever. And as for you, Daniel, keep secret the message and seal the book until the end of time. Many shall fall away, and evil shall increase." So this is in people's minds. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about that theology that's understood, but I want to get into the history of the events that take place. Because the fact is that not everybody is going to roll over and play dead for Antiochus Epiphanes. There is a rebellion that rises up, and it's started by 3 brothers, and the brothers are Judas, Jonathan, and Simon. And these 3 begin gathering together fellow warriors, freedom fighters who are trying to restore the temple, and the war begins around 164 A.D., goes on to 141. So it's a long, involved war. It is a guerrilla war, and finally the Greeks are unable to deal with this guerrilla warfare, and so little by little they find themselves retreating back to Syria. In 141, Jerusalem fell to the rebels, and so now in comes Simon Maccabeus. These are the Maccabee brothers, who comes in and cleanses the temple and restores the sacrifice. And of course, to this day, Jews celebrate this as a great moment of religious freedom and religious liberty, and that, of course, is the Feast of Hanukkah, the Feast of the Lights. In 134, he then he dies and is then replaced by John Hyrcanus, who is his son, and he stays on the throne until 104. Then his oldest son, Astrobulus, dies, and his second son then takes over. And he has a very long reign from 102 to 76 BC. So we're coming up on time here. Yeah. That's unfortunate that he lived so long. And the second son is not all that great. He expands the empire. And he's able to do that because the Seleucids have been weakened through that civil war. He also marries a woman, Alexandra Salome. Now, did you notice his name is Alexander? And her name is Alexandra. Both of them have some kind of a Greek thing going on here, a little bit of Hellenism there. He has 2 sons. One of them is Hyrcanus II, and the other is Astrobulus II. And the 2 of them are rivals, one to the other. And as a result, that weakens everybody, causes a vacuum, and who takes note but the new guy on the block, Rome. Rome has been expanding. Rome has taken over all of Italy little by little, has now had 3 wars with the Carthaginians, and as a result of those is the dominant power of the entire Western Mediterranean, is in the process of conquering Gaul, has already conquered Greece and is now inexorably moving further and further. And so this vacuum in Palestine is just inviting them to come in, which is what they're really looking at. And one of the reasons for this is because the Hasmoneans, that is to say, that royal family, are using Greek names. They're conquering peoples and forcing them to become Jews, and therefore there's no longer a racial purity involved in this. That's not popular with the people. They use the title king. Now, before that, they avoided that title because they're not of the Davidic line.
Right.
You know, and so there's a real question as to whether they should do that. And then on top of that, rather than using Jewish troops, you know, the liberators who had liberated the country, they're hiring mercenaries, and many of them are Syrian mercenaries.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah, right. You know. So things are just, you know, really, really pretty bad. So much so that there is a group of Jews who are really object to this, and particularly Alexander Jannaeus, and especially when he takes that king title, and he finds himself in allies. He allies to other nations, to pagan nations. He marries Alexandra, which is now a real issue too, because she had been married once before. Her husband died, so she's a widow. But strictly speaking, if you go back to Leviticus 21:13, you're not supposed to marry a widow, and so he's done that. And so in scriptures it says that anyone who does that will be a base offspring among his people. And so there's a group of Jews who are very, very upset about this, and they're called Pharisees. And so there's a confrontation, direct confrontation between them and the king, and what it leads to is a banquet. It's a very ugly banquet in which the king then, Alexander, throws this banquet for his followers, and the entertainment is the crucifixion of 800 Pharisees. Pretty sad.
That's the banquet entertainment.
That's it.
That sounds like lovely entertainment for a banquet.
Yes, and to add to that, and to the distress of the Pharisees who are being crucified, their children and wives are brought in before them, and they're beheaded, so that the last thing that these men see is the death of their wives and family. Yeah. This just goes to show you. And one of the things that happens then as a result of this event is that the Pharisees who survive this become absolutely non-political. The Pharisees that Jesus comes in contact with in that first century are going to be men who are very, very devout and follow the law very carefully and encourage others to do that also, but they are not going to take a direct role in politics. Pharisees have a tendency to be apolitical, and part of it is because of this event here. Now, none of this does anything to strengthen the Hasmonean position in Palestine, and the Romans smell blood, and so by now already Syria has become a Roman province. This is in 65 BC, and a very powerful Roman general has come there. His name is Pompey, and he realizes that he's got two opponents down in Palestine. One of them is a very clever and and then another one is very stupid. And so he decides he's going, I'm talking about the two sons here, and he makes himself then become the arbiter between the two. Now, interestingly enough, he's invited in to do this because the two brothers can't get along with each other. Teresa, that's like a bunch of teenagers getting together and opening up a Ouija board.
Yes.
You know, you're just asking for trouble.
Yes.
And that's exactly what happens then. Well, one of the brothers, Astrobulus II, and his supporters flee to the temple precincts, and they lock themselves in there. And at this point, then, the Romans come in with soldiers. And also the other sons' troops, and they storm into the temple, and the temple is desecrated now for a second time, and this time at the hands of the Roman soldiers. There's a maniple of soldiers. It's a unit. It's a handful, literally, a handful of soldiers who actually break into the Holy of Holies. They open the place up, bring in torches, and Pompey walks in, and he looks around. And later on, it's recorded in the historian Tacitus of what he found, and Tacitus's own words. It was vacuum sedum et inania arcana. That's what he found. He found an empty seat and an inane, ridiculous arcania. Nothing there. So. Then he leaves, but the Roman involvement now is there, and it's going to complicate the scene. And you end up with peace for a price. The Romans then say, okay, fine, we're going to take care of this place, but you got to help us out a little bit. We need a little help, and we want all of the coastal cities. And the Jews say, fine, no big deal. We're not really great sailors to begin with. He goes, okay, good. And on the interior, we would like to have all those cities that are Greek cities that the Greeks had founded. And the Jews go, fine, they're a bunch of Greeks anyway, you know. So their own country is being compromised and taken away. Hyrcanus II is confirmed as the high priest, but he's not going to be allowed to use the term king anymore. That kind of makes the Pharisees happy, you know. Instead, he's given the title of ethnarch. What about Astrobulus? Well, you know, after the temple fell, he and his family were taken, and they were moved. He had two sons. They were moved to Rome, where they were put into something like house arrest. Okay. You know, and so they were just kind of quietly kept there. But from the Roman point of view, this is a moment in which Rome was falling apart through a civil war. This is the time of Julius Caesar and all those guys. It turns out that Hyrcanus is incompetent. He's not going to be a good toady for the Romans after all. And he finds himself being dominated by a sheikh out of the southern regions. It's an area called Idumea. He's a convert to Judaism. He's an Arab. And, I mean, this goes back to Genesis, you know, the Isaac and Ishmael stuff. But now this man is, this sheikh is influencing the ethnarch who is being supported by the Romans over the Jewish people. Okay, not a good situation. His name is Antipater. Okay. Pompey recognizes him as a good administrator, and so he gets more and more power, including having one of his sons go up to Galilee to take over as, the term for it is the strategos, that is to say the general. He's sort of a governor general of Galilee. His name is Herod. He's the guy. And one of the things he does is he suppresses the Galilean rebels that are running around up in that area. On January 12th of 49 BC, the world changed. A Roman general who had been campaigning up in Gaul took his army and went back to Italy, and he crossed the boundary line. It was called the Rubicon. I'm talking, of course, of Gaius Julius Caesar. And when he did that, now the Roman Civil War became a real war, and specifically between him on the one hand and the supporter of the Senate supported him, Pompey, and they met in battle, and Caesar defeated Pompey. Now remember that Pompey had been supporting Antipater, okay, but now it doesn't look too good for Antipater, except Antipater then becomes a friend of Caesar. This he's as slippery as can
he is.
be. And so he's a good friend of Caesar's until March 15th of 44 B.C. Ides of March. And so he had to find a new friend real fast. He finds it in one of the men who stabbed Julius Caesar to death, a Roman senator called Cassius. He had been appointed then, after Caesar is killed, Cassius is then sent to Syria to become the governor of Syria. And so Antipater figures, well, I can work with this guy. What he wasn't counting on was his own death, and Antipater died shortly after Cassius arrived. So his son then, Herod, takes over the same position, and he particularly cuts his teeth on anti-Roman riots. He's going around putting down Roman riots, which of course makes him very popular with the Romans. But Herod has a real issue to work with also, because when he's looking at Rome, there are actually three individuals. Now, these three individuals have made peace in Rome and ended the Civil War by coming together and sharing power together. Okay, and this is that famous triumvirate. This is what's called the second triumvirate of Mark Antony, Octavian, and the lesser known of the group, Lepidus. And here we have a situation in which Herod is going to have to figure out which one of these guys is going to be the ultimate winner, you know. And he also has another brother. Herod does. Phasael, and so they're trying to figure out this whole Roman thing, and in the process, one of the three of the triumvirate comes to the east, and his intention, his job, is to gather the Roman armies together to attack the Parthians, who are always a problem for the Romans anyway. And while he's doing that, gathering around, going to various parts of the eastern part of the Roman Empire, he comes to Egypt and falls in love with this gal called Cleopatra. Cleopatra is a Ptolemy. Okay, she's of that dynasty. She's the queen of Egypt. Okay, and so the two of them ultimately start plotting to use a combined Eastern Roman and Egyptian army and navy in order to take over the Roman Empire, and that would be, of course, the end of the triumvirate.
Yes.
Now, Lepidus he's there mainly because he's got a lot of money. Okay, but Octavian is there because he's the son of Julius Caesar, and he's not to be discounted.
That's right.
Right. While you have the contest then between Octavian on the one hand and Mark Antony and Cleopatra on the other, Rome is in kind of a little bit of a turmoil, and this allows the remember Astrobulus II was being held in house arrest in Rome. Well, it's his youngest son who is still around. I think Astrobulus is dead by now, but his youngest son, his name is Antigonus, escapes from Rome, goes all the way over to Parthia. That's present-day Persia. Tells the Parthians what's going on, and then gets a bribe to go back to Jerusalem to become kind of the Parthian toady as the high priest. So he brings this bribe back to Jerusalem in order to bribe all of the noble families, the high priests and others, and it includes 1,000 talents. Now I'm assuming those are talents of silver, but 1,000, that's a bunch of bucks. And he brings with him 500 women. Oh my God. I'll read Daniel Rope, who's just he's got some really great lines. His line on this one was a curious tribute for a claimant to the high priesthood. Antigonus arrives in Jerusalem. He takes over Jerusalem. The bribe seems to have worked out. Herod, as a result, has to flee. He flees to the fortress of Masada, and then from there escapes and flees on to Rome. So, no, things are beginning to settle in Rome. By this time, you've got the great battle of Actium has taken place. Antony and Cleopatra are defeated in this naval battle. Antony is killed in Egypt. Ultimately, as he arrives in Egypt, he's killed, and Cleopatra, of course, commits suicide. And so Octavian then starts looking around for, and remember, he's going to change his name to Augustus. He will be the first Caesar. Looking around to try to restore some sort of order in Palestine, and he decides that this political exile, Herod, is the guy to do it. And so he presents him to the Senate, and in 40 BC, the Senate makes him King Herod of Judea. Okay, and in response to that, he then goes over with some of the senators and offers incense to one of the pagan gods' altars. So this is a guy. Now think about this. He's the son of this Arab sheikh. Mm-hmm. He's an Idioman. Okay, he is a nominal Jew, and offering sacrifice to a pagan god in order to get this position. And now he's a king, and he's not of the Davidic line. This is the same fellow, remember, that the Magi are going to come to and say, we're looking for the King of the Jews. Can you imagine his thinking in that? So they set sail then. He brings with him 11 legions of soldiers, along with 6,000 cavalry. In 37 B.C., the Jerusalem falls, and again, Henri Daniel Rope says, as usual, great massacres followed the capture. The Sanhedrin refused to recognize him as king. Okay, they are decimated. That is to say, 1 out of every 10 of them is taken out and slaughtered. I guess I should say something, too, about Pharisees and Sadducees. We just have a couple minutes.
Yes.
Okay. Sadducees are followers. I'm talking about the Sadducees here. The Sadducees are followers of Zadok, who is the high priest of Solomon. You have to go back to 1 Kings, the 2nd chapter, to find him. It is not a school of theology. It's a priestly family. Okay, so they're related to Zadok, and they always had important temporal roles. They were collaborators with those who occupied in order to make life more livable in Jerusalem. Theologically, they're very conservative. They will accept only the Torah, the first 5 books of the Gospel. They do not accept any of the rabbinic schools or any of the rabbinic commentaries. That frees them up, for one thing. And as a result of that, they do not believe in immortality of the soul, final judgment, angels, devils, the Apocrypha, or the Talmud. Okay? That's that group. And, of course, they're very much around, and they're the temple elite at the time of Jesus. The Pharisees, as I said, are apolitical, and they have a much greater apocalyptic dream of the end times. And when they look and they see who's sitting on the throne now, Herod the Great sitting on the throne, they see how bad things are. And they believe that there will be a Messiah who will come and drive the Romans out. And this will be done by a miracle, and it will exalt Jerusalem. And when that happens, the 12 tribes of the righteous who had fled to all parts of the world will come back. There'll be no Romans, no Greeks, no Samaritans. Israel will be restored. It'll be a kingdom of purity and of holiness. There will be then the kingdom of God. Okay? Now, they're going to pray for this, and they're going to live a righteous life in order to bring it about. There are others who are going to say, yeah, but, think globally but act locally, and they're going to, these are the terrorists, the Sicarii, the zealots, who we've already met. And so all of this is going to be coming together then at this moment. Now, what we're going to do next time around is we're going to zero in on those days right around the time of Christ, and see how all these different, now we've had something of a history of how these groups came about. We're going to see how they interact with each other, and it's going to be so exciting because I'm excited about it. It's going to be so exciting because the very words of the New Testament are going to have a sort of a historical grounding with all of this. Yeah.
Oh, that sounds great.
Yeah.
All right. We'll look forward to next week. Another great show, though, Father.
Oh, good.
So we close quickly with a prayer and a blessing.
Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in
the beginning, is now, and ever shall be,
world without end. Amen.
May Almighty God bless you in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Amen. Thank you, Father.
Okay.
Thank you, Father.
Okay.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.